Welcome back to Walk with TFB. Tim Bryson here, and as y'all know, I'm a Black millennial who's eager to have unfiltered conversation with authentic people centered on international education, global sport, and Black culture. Similar to a lot of these episodes this season, this guest and really this episode has been in the making for a number of years. It was not on purpose nor coincidental that it happened this way, but it did. And this episode and this timing is certainly on purpose. Now, I know this individual really since my grad school days back at Ohio State, which I know we'll talk a little bit more about in the beginning. But this person, as y'all know, then see the name, see the face, is someone who is truly carving out and amplifying the experiences of a student population, a subpopulation in the college sports space that, quite honestly, all of us need to be more aware of, need to invest in, and also recognize our role in helping to amplify and create an experience in college sport that is equal, if not equitable, to the experiences of their peers around them. But like I said, it's not my episode. This is my friend's episode. And so without further ado, y'all help me welcome Amari Dryden to the podcast. What's poppin', homie?
Thank you so much. It's so good to see you. And yeah, we've known each other for like 7 years now. So wild to believe it's been that long.
That's what I'm saying. So hold on, take us back, yo. So for those who follow me on LinkedIn, I don't think I posted that, so I apologize. I need to post that joint on LinkedIn about what when you came to our class. That might be tomorrow's post, but nevertheless, take us back because I know we talked about it in class. But take us back. Were you in ELI? You said, and then stopped.
Yes, for a hot second, I was in ELI. And I literally for a hot second, like maybe a month, I was in ELI because and I'll get into this when I talk about my story, but your girl tries to do too much sometimes
Yeah.
in college. I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to do all the things and take advantage of everything. And so
Uh-huh.
ELI had heard such great things about it, had friends who had done it, was like, yeah, I'm gonna do that, knowing there's no way I can really fit that into my schedule. So I tried really hard to do that, but then, mental health takes a toll on you.
Sure.
So having to quit ELI, honestly, I will say low key saved my life because
It's a blessing.
had I continued doing ELI, I would not have been able to go to Ohio State's therapy. So I had to
Mm.
take a step back from something I really wanted to do to take care of my mental health. So, and I'm still here and we still got to connect. So I
That's
think
a
I got what I
blessing.
needed out of ELI, which was you.
That's a blessing. No, appreciate you sharing that even to start this conversation. So you were there for a month. That was probably my first semester. I had no clue what the fuck I was doing. And they know, everyone knows that. But we were still connected throughout our time there? Like,
Yeah. Like just
that's
the first
wild.
meeting, I feel like we're doing collages or something.
Yeah,
And
probably.
I was talking about athletics, and you're like, oh, you want to do that? I want to do that. And so that's how our conversation
Oh,
kind of got started and how our friendship blossomed. And here we are.
it's a blessing. Wow. Well, segment one, man. Let's get right into it. You started to share a little bit about your time at Ohio State, alma mater, of course. But Mario, for the people that may not know, or those that need to know more about you, what's your story?
Yeah, I was reflecting on this when I was driving back from Ohio State this past weekend because I went to homecoming, driving
Mm-hmm.
back to Nashville of like, what do I want to say? And I realized how much college sports impacted and impacts, so both past tense and present tense, my life as a non-student athlete. So I did not grow up playing sports. I am competitive, I will tell you that, but sports was not in the cards in terms of playing, but
Mm-hmm.
just being a fan. So I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. Both of my parents went to the University of Louisville, also worked there for the majority of my childhood. We
Mm.
lived like 2 miles away from campus. So I was just always in that college setting. And
Oh,
then we also were just big sports fans too. So grew up being a U of L fan and an Ohio State fan. And looking back, I was like, almost everything we did revolved around sports in some
mm.
way. And so it makes so much sense that I now work in this space. And that's also how I got into wanting to support Native American student athletes. But like to call myself really just a student athlete advocate and I've always been that way from my adolescence to now of I remember I love going to U of L games, all the different sports, and just love the student athletes. Like it wasn't
Mm,
even the game necessarily that I loved. It was just getting to support student athletes in whatever sport they were playing and what they were doing. I was always interested in learning where are they from? Why do they play their sport? What are they majoring in? What do they want to do in life? So it makes
mm-hmm,
sense that I'm now the director of career development for an athletic
mm-hmm,
department.
mm-hmm.
But just growing up, I always felt that way. Like I remember think this may have been like 8th grade. And my dad gotten me the University of Louisville men's basketball media guide back when they like actually
Mm,
printed those out. And
yeah.
you would go to places and like have the athletes sign them and stuff. And I would quiz myself on the roster of, okay, and so I have specific teams, and I'm like, that's my team. I can name so many things about them because I was quizzing myself on them. Like, all right, Peyton Siva, freshman, number 3
Yeah.
from Seattle, Washington, went to Franken High School. Father Peyton Siva Sr., sister Leilani, brother Michael, major in communication. I still
What?
remember that. And also, fun fact, that team of U of L men's basketball just did the basketball tournament this past summer. So I got to see them play again. So it just made my heart sing, specifically Peyton Siva.
Yeah, he
But
was
so
good.
that was just how I've always been of wanting to support student athletes and wanting to
Mm-hmm.
know what are you doing afterward. I saw them as my family. I saw them as my siblings, my older siblings. I'm the oldest, and I'm also 8.5 years older than my brother. So I
Wow.
pretty much spent my life as or the adolescence as an only child. So
Mm-hmm.
student athletes were seen as my siblings, and I considered them
Mm.
my family. So lots of tears were shed because of games and all of that, because I'm like, no, they're sad, so that makes me sad, and navigating that. But that was kind of how I got into Native American student athletes, which was because of Shoni and Jude Schimmel, who were two women's basketball players who played at U of L when I was in high school, and just learning about their story and their experience at U of L, but also prior, and then coming to the university. I'm like, oh, I want to learn more about them. And when they got to the Final Four, and I think the 2012 to 13 season,
Mm.
that was the first time Native American or any Native American student athlete had been on a team in men's or women's basketball that had gone that far. I'm like,
Mm. Mm.
how is that possible? Like, I know Native people play basketball. Like, res ball is a thing. Why is it that we don't have Native Americans at that D1 level? And also recognizing, seeing Shoni and Jude, because, U of L women's basketball is great. Like, we don't have any national championships, sad face, but we're up there. But I remember on Shoni's senior night, and we play at the KFC Yum Center, which our men's and women's basketball teams play at the same arena, which I appreciate.
Yep.
It's 22,000 people, sold out. I would say probably at least 70% were Native Americans there just to see Shoni and Jude on, or specifically Shoni's last regular season home game. Hearing people say, oh, I came from Alaska, or it took me 2 flights and a bus to get here. So traveling 20 hours for a hour and a half game. Like, that just meant so much to me, but also seeing how much it meant to the Native community, I was like, this cannot be it. It can't just be Shoni and Jude. So we've got to get that going more. And so that's where my kind of passion and advocacy for Native American student athletes came into play. And that's where I want to have my entire career fall under that category. So that's my story.
Well, okay, that was beautifully said. And just to clarify, that sold out game where people were flying all around such of the world to come, that was 2012 ish.
That was like 2013,
So
I think.
before college.
Yes, this was when I was in high school. So like right before
So
I went to college.
so you saw that, obviously piqued your interest in the game, something that has never gone away and will never probably go away. Yeah, you go to Ohio State and somehow find yourself in Fisher, I'm assuming, the business
Yes.
school.
Yeah.
So just talk us through before we get to segment 2. Why, like, what was you want to work in sports and athlete development, whatever was at that call at that
Uh-huh.
time, but you in Fisher? Like, what's up?
Yeah. So my 18-year-old brain was like, and part of this, I'm not going to blame my dad, but he had a part of it too. But he's like, business degree, you can do anything with that. I'm like, yeah, that's
True.
true. Also, in my 18-year-old brain, I'm like, well, if I don't work in sports, or if I happen to not be able to work in sports, then I'm not able to do anything with that degree.
Mm,
In hindsight, I'm like, that's a load of BS.
mhm, mhm,
But in my
mhm,
brain, it was like, oh, well, yeah, let me do business and then I'll go to grad school for what I actually care about. So grad school was always something
mm,
I wanted to do as well. Like that's how I actually got to Ohio State, was because my mom got her master's at OSU and I was born at Ohio State's hospital. So I can literally say I was born a Buckeye. And so it was more so, let's do something businessy. That's what my dad does. So then I fell into accounting because that's what
wow.
my dad does.
Yeah.
The accounting route was like, oh, this is fine. Like I like math. Like it wasn't bad, but then it got to the point where I didn't like it anymore and it was too late to switch. So I had to suffer through majoring in accounting. The sport industry program at OSU was new. So I was like, oh, we don't know what's going on over there. It's really hard to get into Fisher
Mhm.
outside, like once you're in Ohio State. So I was directly admitted as in
Yeah.
going into OSU. So I was like,
Mhm.
let me just, use the clout of Fisher College of Business on this resume and then go into grad school for what I actually care about. But then I did not listen to myself and did my accounting internships and then worked in public accounting full time for less than a year
That's
because,
it?
again, it was a situation of, I use the analogy, it's like I made it to the league, but I hate playing my sport. It looks so great on the outside, but on the inside, you're like, I hate my life. So that was me in public accounting working at EY. So then was like, I got to make a pivot. And I did that. No other job lined up. It was just, mental health means a lot to me, and this job ain't it. So quit, didn't move home, but started working with my mother a little bit in the nonprofit she worked at. And
Mhm.
then was like, well, let me start applying to grad school, and was figuring out, do I want to go sport administration? Do I want to
Mhm.
go higher ed? And like, I
Mhm.
you did higher ed, and also made the distinction of, if I know I want to work in college athletics, and if I can't work with student athletes, I'd rather work with students than athletes.
Mm.
So that's where I made that decision of, let me go that HESA higher ed route
Mhm.
versus sport management or sport administration. Did that at OSU because I'm like, I don't feel like moving away from Columbus,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
also HESA's program was fabulous.
Yeah.
And then that's kind of how I made that transition into college sports. So that's what it ended up looking like.
This is good. So then before we get directly into talking more about Native American athlete experiences, this is a question I'm curious about personally, and I'm not trying to be in your pockets. But as someone who has a sibling who worked for Big Four and know how much money they were making, to then say I'm cool with this and go in a different career where at least on perceivably the money's not the same, I'll just leave it at that. Obviously, you mentioned mental health is important, but whether it be the conversation with your dad or even conversation with other influencing, people around you, what was that process like? Just being able to communicate, like, that's not it for me no more. Again, protecting mental health and whatnot. There's other areas more important for a number of different reasons. Just talk to us more about that conversation. I think for those, whether it be students or others looking to pivot, it could be a beneficial to them as well.
Of course. Yeah, it was a situation. I can say money doesn't buy happiness, but it does buy comfort. Like
Mm,
at EY, we were getting paid by monthly, or not by monthly, by weekly. And so my first paycheck covered rent, utilities, everything. Second
Jesus.
paycheck, just savings. Or
Yeah.
I never actually spent it all, but
Yeah.
was like, oh, let me just buy some stuff because hey, I've got the money for it. So
Yeah.
I will say that is, having that padding is, because I'm a relatively frugal person. Like I'm not one to just splurge on everything. Not a very materialistic person, definitely more the experiences side.
Yep.
But like I've got a decent amount in my savings because of that. So
Yeah.
was able to still live and survive in Columbus without essentially having a real job during that time. Or, when COVID hit, because that's when I started grad school in August of 2020, essentially moved home to live with my mom. And I was able to pay for both my rent back in Columbus, even though I wasn't living there, and help provide with like groceries and stuff like that when I lived with my mom. So
Makes sense.
that was a blessing of, okay, I saved a decent amount of money so that I can still live while having a lesser salary. I mean, the salary that I have now is a little bit in number, it's a little bit higher than what I was making at EY, but cost of living in Nashville is
Cost of
drastically
living.
higher than in Columbus,
Yeah.
Ohio.
Yeah.
So that's where it's like, okay, now I have credit card debt a little bit, but I do have savings still. So I'm
Yeah,
still navigating that.
and you got your mental too, which, as you mentioned, that's
Yes.
most that's
Yes.
most important.
Mhm.
And so segment two, you mentioned this a little bit in regards to how you got introduced to this athlete community, the student population. But I'm curious, especially because as you started grad school, right? Unlike myself, I didn't know anything, was not even considering international athletes in grad school. You knew going in, like who you wanted to study alongside, what
Right.
you want to focus your work on. But going into a higher ed program at any school, Native American students, let alone athletes, there's like there might be a page or two in the book if there's a
Right.
book, right? So like just and again, understanding grad school was very pivotal in shaping obviously where you are now, Vandy. So like what was that 2 year experience like knowing going in like I want to focus on Native American athlete experiences. I want to make their life better in college. Like how did you find support? Obviously you go the thesis route. Just talk to us more about that process in grad school.
Yeah, of course. I was able to do any of the assignments we had. I made it either about Native American college students or about student athletes,
Awesome.
because that was kind of the thought process of, well, if I'm going this thesis route, I need to be doing research
Mm-hmm.
while I'm doing classwork. Like, it has to all be in one. It can't be two
Mm-hmm.
separate things.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I made that decision for the thesis the second semester of that first year, because you really kind of have to declare that early of, are you doing the case exam or are you doing the thesis? And in my brain, hindsight, am I happy I did the thesis? Yes. It was a lot of work though, compared to what my peers had to do for the case exam. I ain't gonna lie on that. But
Mm-hmm.
I knew that I would enjoy it more, because with the case exam, it was like, oh, you get a prompt and you got 2 weeks to do it, but you don't know what the prompt is until you get it. I'm like, my
Mm-hmm.
anxious ass is like, oh, absolutely not. I need to know what I'm gonna be writing about. So I was like, I'd rather write over a long period of time versus not know and just hope for the best. So that
Mm,
was my kind of thought process there. And eventually was like, maybe I could do PhD. So I have been ruminating on that a little bit more as of late, just to make that transition. But initially when I talked to my advisor, I'm like, when she asked, oh, do you have a topic in mind? I told him, like, really interested in Native American student athletes, and kind of gave my spiel there. She was like, oh, you could take that to tenure. And I'm like, what? I'm not thinking about being a professor. Like, what are you talking about? And then,
mm-hmm.
fast forward, I'm like, oh yeah, I could do the PhD, couldn't I? Or, oh, I could be a professor. Like, I'm actually more
Mm,
seriously thinking about that. What I want to teach necessarily, I don't know. It's probably more like the research route, in the
mm,
when people do PhDs but then become like more practitioners.
mm-hmm.
That's probably what I would want to do, versus, all right, now I'm going to go teach in a athletic studies program or a HESA
Mm-hmm.
program, and we're focusing
Mm-hmm.
on that.
Yep.
So that's where my utilizing HESA to jumpstart my career in Native American student athletes came about. But yeah, there's not much literature on, I will say there's, I don't want to say zero, but very
Very, very
little
little.
literature about Native American student athletes. When I was first looking, I found one dissertation and was like, yes, there's a dissertation.
Mm-hmm.
But then it was like, there's only one.
Mm-hmm.
How? So I was looking through, I'm like, all right, what is this woman's references? And a woman, Dr. Elise Ali Joseph, she ended up then becoming the mentor for my thesis, because I reached out to her. I
Oh.
was like, hey, I see you did this. She was a Native American athlete herself at the D1 level. I was like, hey, I'm interested in this. See that you did it. And now she's a faculty athletic rep at Northern Arizona. And she was like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad somebody else wants to pick up the torch and do this work. Because
Hmm.
she published her dissertation, I think, in like 2013. So right
A
around
while
the
ago.
time that Shoni and Jude were in college, but I can't remember if she included them at all in her work. She might have, but and then found one other dissertation later on from another woman, Dr. Natalie Welch. Again, she became another mentor for my thesis. So
Hmm.
I had two Indigenous women who had done research on this role before and then had them inform this work, and then luckily enough had my chair of my thesis committee at for the OSU's HESA program. She used to work at Oklahoma and had done work with Indigenous people there. So she was
Mm.
helpful in being able to say, all right, I don't know a lot about the athletic side, but I can talk about the Indigenous side. So that was
Mm.
helpful because I know if I did, a person was like, oh, I only know the athletic side, the native part is almost more important than the sport part.
Hmm.
So I need
Hmm.
somebody to help me with that. So that's kind of how I used my HESA program to do all of this.
This is good. And so as you're going through the thesis process, as well as having these conversations with whether it be future mentors, current Native athletes, et cetera, what have you found? Right? What are you finding as it relates to their experience, opportunities for athletic departments to better support them? But just generally speaking, just give us some, introduction to what you're finding and or have found to this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah, thinking about my thesis, so I was able to have 3 participants. I wanted them to all be current student athletes, but that didn't happen. So we have 1 current student athlete and then 2 former, and it kind of worked out to where one was a sophomore, one had been out of school about 10 years, the other had been out of school about 20 years. So kind of was able to look at it from a timeline standpoint of, okay, the person who was struggling with things 20 years ago, oh, some of those things that they struggle with are still happening today. Why is that? Or what does that look like? So a lot of the times people had mentioned that, or the people that I interviewed, they were the only Native people in their community. They grew up in predominantly white situations or communities to where the only Native people were their family. And they also all were of mixed race descent. So it's like one parent was Native and the other parent was something else. So that's a whole other thing that we can get into of like mixed race versus full-blooded. And like, I don't even want to use that terminology of just, it's almost the reverse of the one drop rule for Black people
Yeah.
in that regard. But for a couple of the folks, it was around like, because my thesis was about how did you pick the college that you chose, so college choice, and then what was your experience both academically and athletically at your institution. So one of them was like, I'm picking a place that has a Native American studies program. That's the
Mm.
only colleges that I'm looking at because I want to use education to help my community and learn more about myself. So
Mm.
that was one person's thought process. Another one was, I just want something that's relatively close to home and is a good athletic program. Other was more their major, like, this is the major that I want, and it doesn't matter if they have resources for my identity or not. A lot of the times, either the school had, and this was kind of the spectrum because of the participants I had, one school had a bunch of different resources, had a bunch of faculty, had a lot of resources for Native students. One, there was literally none, and it was in a place where it's a state that has like 7 different reservations, or like the closest
Mm.
reservation's 45 minutes away. So it's like, why would you not have resources for a place that has a large Native population? The math is not mathing there. And then other one was, oh, they have a Native American cultural center, but because of my sport, I'm not able to go to their events. So that was some of the research and findings that I saw, was either folks didn't know how the recruiting process went and we're just kind of finding schools and we're like, yeah, this will work, or no, I definitely want something that's going to foster my Native identity, and yay, I found a school that did that. So it was kind of a different ends of the spectrum, so to speak, of yes, they are helpful in my
Mm.
identity versus, yeah, I'm just out here by myself. I'm the only Native person in the athletic department, and I'm just having to operate like everything's fine.
And then you completed this thesis when?
I finished it May of 22, so last year. So that
So a
was a
year and a
whole
half.
other thing of writing my thesis while working for Vanderbilt and taking 2 graduate level classes all at the same time.
You did it
So
super well,
my
man.
thesis could have looked a lot better had I had better time management, but also didn't anticipate getting a full-time job my last semester of grad school. So,
Proof. So one thing I've always told you, when especially when you first reached out, I mean, literally years ago at this point, I'm like, more people need to hear about this. Like, more people need to know about this. And so I know you presented at N4A this past summer,
mhm.
2023,
And the
right? And
summer before that too.
so in 22. So I guess just talk to us more about either like the response, as you're presenting in front of these folks, but then also like what can we be doing to continue to amplify this work, right? At least amplify their experience and then get into a place where we can
Mhm.
have conversation about where we can improve, which we'll talk to in just a second.
Right. Yeah. So I think in terms of the reactions, it was more, oh, I never thought of this. Or,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I don't think we like, I don't even know if we have any Native American student athletes in our in our athletic department. Cause that's a whole other piece of if you don't have them, you may not be thinking about that. So that's part of what I hope to do in my job or career is make sure that institutions have that cultural awareness and are culturally competent to
Mm-hmm.
where will get Native American student athletes coming to want to be at your institution versus, all right, now we have one. We've got to create all this stuff from the ground up because we didn't have the infrastructure already in place.
Mm-hmm.
So that was something that a number of people had reached out to me or followed up after the presentation or when I talked at the research showcase the last N4A of, oh, I wasn't aware of these types of things. Or they're thinking like, oh, when are you going to write a journal article about it? I'm like, can I do my job first?
Mm-hmm.
So those
Mm-hmm.
types of things. I'm like, also, what's the audience of who's actually reading journal articles? Not probably the people who are doing the work. So that's a whole other tangent. But I think with the people who have expressed interest, it's more along the lines of, I have these base level knowledge of, oh, land acknowledgements are a thing now.
Mm-hmm.
How can we do those? Or just also microaggressions against Native Americans. Like a lot of people don't know microaggressions, what they are, and they happen every day and they're in just everybody's vernacular. And I have to be the person to be like, so we shouldn't say that.
Mm-hmm.
And here's why. And because people don't know. So I can't fault people at that of you don't know what you don't know. But now I want to be that advocate to say, hey, I'm gonna broadcast it from the rooftops, which I do need to do a better job of. I know that, and hopefully this podcast will help with it.
Sure.
But just helping people realize, hey, even if you don't have any Native American student athletes at your institution, wouldn't you want some just to kind of increase that diversity? They have a different life experience than a lot of other people. Same thing with all student athletes have different life experiences, but you want to really have that holistic look at the athletic experience. And so having Native American student athletes can help with that. So doing
Mm.
different or seeing what's happening in your communities. Maybe it's not the college doesn't have things, but what if your
Yep.
community does? Like
Yep.
Nashville's about to have a powwow in a couple weeks of, all right, well, I'm going to make sure I'm going to go to that and advertise that to student athletes because they also need volunteers. So it's like, all right, let's take a group of student athletes to go volunteer at a powwow. Or it's like, oh, I didn't know what a powwow was. Like just kind of getting that cultural knowledge around it because, I've done the research on, oh,
Mm-hmm.
it's not being Native American or being a tribal member, it's not just a racial designation, it's a political designation of, when you talk about, oh, the Diné Nation in the Arizona area and that part, that's not just oh, it's a community. Like, no, they operate at the sovereign level. Like, it's the Diné and the federal government, the US federal government who have to talk about things. Like, that's why it's so bad with the murdered and missing Indigenous women of we're not able to prosecute people because it's not at the state level, it has to be at the federal government level, and people don't realize that. So there are loopholes that people are killing folks and making them disappeared, and we can't even do anything about it because it's like, oh well, it's above us, it's above our jurisdiction, and it's an endemic to where people are bringing awareness about it, but are we actually doing anything about it? Are we finding these women? Are we able to help them in that regard? So, and it's also not just the US, like it happens in Canada as well, because
Mm-hmm.
this is Turtle Island, as they like to call it, of we're not big on boundaries, it's all land, and that's a whole other thing. We could do a whole podcast on that, but
Yeah.
just my knowledge of like a word vomit it at people, and so I just need to figure out a way to make it more knowledgeable, or make people more knowledgeable, and kind of put it in bite-sized chunks of, oh, did you know that
Mm.
XYZ, just so people are aware. And earlier this week was Indigenous Peoples Day, which not everybody celebrates that because they're
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, it's Columbus Day. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
so that's a whole other thing too, like advocacy and protesting. That's my shit. So I enjoy those types of things, but not everybody does.
No, this is good. So let me ask you this, because one thing I've realized in my own work with around international with international athletes is like what I'm advocating for quite literally is in opposition to immigration policy in the United States.
Mm,
And that's something that just hit me probably 2 weeks ago. And I'm like, whoa, it's my like, from a
yeah,
support standpoint, this probably where I'm getting a lot of resistance, either
you're right.
subconsciously or consciously. Flipping it back to the Native American experience, right? As you're thinking about again, a lot of people are focused on land acknowledgements, either, from a check the box standpoint, maybe changing a mascot, which a lot more professional teams and college need to change, but checking the box. But
Hmm.
it's deeper than just land acknowledgements, the mascots. Like there's historical, political, geographical
Yes.
implications that are all tied to this. I want you to speak to some more of that, because in our class last week, I mean, you said it beautifully. I'm like, I had no clue Miami was formerly on a reservation or still on a
Hmm.
reservation. I had no clue.
Yeah.
So talk to us more about the geographic,
Right.
political
Hmm.
implications as well.
Yeah, very similar to with you formatting it that way of, yeah, education has been used to de-indigenize or whiten Native American communities. So it's like, oh yeah, come to college, do these types of things. But it's like, okay, but the history was, if you do that, you are leaving your native identity at the door, or you can't be native anymore if you pursue higher education in the US college context, because of the boarding schools, of that's how it was done, of we're going to cut your hair, we're going to make sure you're not speaking your native language anymore, taking away anything that ties to your indigenous essentially indigenous identity. So that's also something that I grappled with and still grapple with, of like, okay, yeah, we want people to come to college and do those types of things, but when they leave, are they still accepted by their communities, or is it, all right, now you're seen as, oh, you did the white man's thing and we don't want you anymore? Like, I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
that's actually the case, but recognizing that's how people sometimes operate, of, oh, you went against our culture, almost, of that's not necessarily seen as, oh, you go to college and you get a good job and that's what you do. A lot of indigenous people, well, they go to college to learn things to then help their communities. So that
Mm.
was something I was looking at of, okay, why are you majoring in what you're majoring in? Or how in athletics, sometimes due to schedule, student athletes aren't always able to major in what they want to major in because it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
fit their athletic schedule due to required classes and required practices, etc. So if you're saying, oh, I want to major in environmental science so I can do XYZ on my reservation back home or in my native community, and we're like, academic advisors, like, well, that's not going to fit your schedule. So you got to figure something else out. They're not going to want to do college. Like the purpose of going to college isn't always sports, how it is for a lot of student athletes of, I just want to keep
Mm-hmm.
continuing and playing that. Like, no, this is a means to an end of, I want to use this to help my community. I recently talked to a former college basketball player. He played in the NBA for a little bit, Damon Bell Holter, and he's from a indigenous community up in Alaska. And he talked about, he's like, basketball was my vehicle to do what I wanted to do by helping my community. Like basketball was just a means to an end. He's like, I wasn't passionate about basketball. It just opened the door for opportunities
Mm-hmm.
for me to do what I wanted.
Yep.
So it's not like, oh, sport is everything to me. It's no, their communities are everything to me, them, and they're able to use their sport to help. So we almost have to think about it differently in that regard because they're operating from a different knowledge space, because sometimes the indigenous knowledge space butts up against the Western version, and
Mm-hmm.
we're like, oh, well, I remember learning, and he said it's like it's easier to change an environment to fit a person than it is to change a person to fit an environment. And I feel like that's all college is we're trying to fit people into those cookie cutter boxes, and especially for Native student athletes, that's not going to work. So
Mm.
we have to really change it up to where it actually makes sense for them. And so that's what I hope to do in my work is help student athletes, indigenous student athletes, find those places that do suit them and make sure that those colleges will support them in that regard.
It's good. Last question before going to segment 3, yo. You mentioned college choice with a thesis, right? You just gave an example around major selection. But what's next as you're looking to continue building out a robust program and creating an environment for Indigenous athletes to thrive? What's next in that process, that design process, as you move forward throughout your career?
Yeah, I think it's making sure that communities are included within that as well. Of part of the college choice part was also recruiting. Of some folks knew about the recruiting process, other people didn't. A lot of indigenous people live in communities that aren't necessarily close to colleges, or it's by tribal colleges, and in places where, you know, it's different than probably you or me of like, oh, I've always lived like 20 to 30
Mm-hmm.
minutes away from an airport. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
they will have heard conversations like, oh, I'll fly into Phoenix, but then I have a 3-hour drive just home after that. I'm like, bro, what?
Dang.
So being able to recognize, you know, if it's hard for the student athletes just to get home, coaches aren't going to want to do that to actually go into these communities and figure that out. So it's
That's a good point.
not only you selling the school or selling yourself to the student athlete, but you're having to sell it to their families and their communities. And I think that's part of why the University of Louisville worked for Shoni and Jude was they would go to their reservation in Oregon and like say hello, see that, you know, Shoni was one of the best high school players coming out of high school. So it was like, all right, well, everybody wanted her, but U of L got her. I'm like, well, how did that happen? She moved 2,000 miles away from home. And it's like we had some sort of a community, but also recognize like, hey, we're going to operate to where we have resources for you and can help you in that regard to where you do feel supported here. So and recognizing once you get one, you're getting the community. Like when Shoni and Jude would go to away games, like at Syracuse or other places, like fans of the other teams were staying back to get their autographs and supporting them. Like I kind of want to do a study on the times that Shoni and Jude were at away games. Did the attendance increase for those games because there was
Mm.
native people from those communities were coming because they wanted to see Shoni and Jude? Like I really want to look up to see if that's a thing or not. I feel like it is, but I can't prove that yet. But
Mm.
so recognizing you're not only getting that community and their family, you're getting an entire community. With Shoni and Jude, Indian country essentially was cheering for them. Of like, I've never seen so many people cheering for U of L before. And it's like, this is
Wow.
amazing as a U of L fan. But recognizing, we want to keep that going. Like, I can name on really one hand how many D1, maybe Power 5 basketball players that I can name who came after Shoni and Jude. I kind of focus on basketball. There's a decent amount in like softball. I think softball is the largest number of Native American women in that sport, and it's football for men. But recognizing, okay, we don't always hear about them, so how can we support them? Or maybe they're not outward about their Native identity, but Shoni and Jude were, because there's a whole documentary done about it. But other people may not be outward about it either, so you can't just look at the check boxes of, oh, they said American Indian or Alaska Native on their demographic forms when they came into college, so they're Native and we're gonna do all this support for them. Like, it can't be blanket. It needs to be, all right, we recognize you come from this specific tribe.
Mm-hmm.
How does that operate? A Plains Indian versus somebody from the Pacific Northwest, those are drastically different communities and drastically different indigenous tribes. So you can't treat them the same way. You can't really do that pan-indigenous resources necessarily. Sometimes it can work, but I think it's better to say, like, hey, we recognize you come from this community. Like, not all Native Americans love fry bread. That's not necessarily the case, but for certain communities, that is kind of a larger common denominator, but that was because of the Trail of Tears. So again, food that a lot of we almost associate with Native Americans is because, all right, on the Trail of Tears, all they had was flour and something else and built a fire and was able to create fry bread. So it's not really an indigenous dish the way we want to say it is. It's because they were forced from their homes and that was all they could eat. So that's a whole other thing too.
Wow, no, it's important to note though. I mean, both from a language standpoint, but also contextual to say like, what, what, what may we be saying or sharing that's perpetuating harm or creating
Mm-hmm.
harm. But yeah, it's important to note. But I do want to make sure that we have time going into segment 3 to really discuss how we can best support you, your work, and your purpose journey. So whether that be from an advocacy standpoint, sharing knowledge standpoint, but how can we best support you, your work, Native American athletes, and your purpose journey as well?
Yeah, I would say learning more about indigenous cultures, whether that's the history or the communities of where you're from, where you currently live, kind of like land acknowledgements, but learning more about, okay, well, who are the tribes that were said in these land acknowledgements and where are they now? Because a lot of them are still around. It's not like, oh, all Native people are extinct, or that, I mean, sadly, there are communities that are extinct because of genocide that the government put upon them, but there are a lot that are still around, and just learning more about their experiences. How can you support them? Are there Native owned businesses that you can support through various avenues? On a sports side of things, one social media piece that I always look at is Indian sports. So the letters NDN sports. That's a Twitter and also Instagram, social media website page that advocates for and just kind of advertises Native Americans in the sports that they're doing. Goes from little as kindergarten age children all the way up to like professional Native American athletes. So learning more about, oh, this person is from this community and they just won their high school softball 3A championship. Like, oh, that's cool. And in my brain goes to, oh, I wonder where they're going to go to college, but maybe they're not thinking about college. I don't
Wow.
know. So it's figuring out, how can we best support indigenous athletes in that space of, okay, I want to make sure that they're seen, they're heard, they're being broadcasted out, so we can get over the hump of, oh, there aren't any. When there are, they maybe just aren't being publicized as much as we want them to. So recognizing, tribal colleges, those are places that are just for Indigenous people. A lot of them have sports, but they operate at the NAIA level versus the NCAA level, or they're 2-year colleges. So it's the NJCAA. So it's
Mm-hmm.
those aren't places that we're seeing on ESPN or you get
Mm-hmm.
in the app or whatever. Like you almost have to go to a specific school of like this random place that I've never heard of. And oh, well, here's a bunch of Native student athletes of how can we support them in some way? Like I know the University of New Mexico actually did an NIL
Oh,
deal where a local Native American business offered, I can't remember what it was. It may have just been gear or
I think I saw that. Yep.
shirts or
I see
something
it.
to where it's like, oh, you can support these Native athletes by wearing your turquoise shirts and that type of thing. Supporting Nike and Seven, which is Nike's Native American branch, that all the proceeds of those gear that's been promoted goes to the fund that funds Native American I think athletics and doing that in different communities, those types of things just to bring more awareness, yes, but also just learning more about those communities. Like for me, it expanded my horizons around so much, like learning the history of, oh, that's why that's that name, or 30 out of 50 states are technically indigenous names, but nobody thinks about that. Or like your cities, those types of things. Like we're not constantly thinking of like, oh, Ohio, that's the Seneca word for great river. Nobody knows what Ohio means in that regard. They're just like,
Wow.
oh, Ohio, like, or Kentucky, like where I'm from, like any of those types of things. We are not thinking about indigenous culture and indigenous like language is all
Wow.
around us, but it's been erased to where we don't know the reasoning behind it or anything along those lines. So I think that's something of knowledge is power, you can potentially say in that
Mm,
regard. But I think that knowledge around Native athletes and being an advocate for them is
mm,
helpful. But kind of getting to your question again on how people can assist me in my advocacy is like if there are ways that I can help you in promoting different resources, or I love doing research. Like I will look at a school's website and search Native American or Indigenous just to see what pops up. And the amount of times where nothing pops up, I'm like, okay, cool, there needs to be something done. Or it's like, oh, it's just saying the data of how many students we have, or it's not even the context of talking about, oh, this is centered around Indigenous people. It's like someone just happened to say Native American in this article and that's why it popped up.
mm,
So that's something that I'm passionate about. So if they're almost doing like a Native American cultural audit of
mm-hmm.
schools, like
Mm-hmm.
that sounds so fun to me. Like, right, well, let's take a
Mm,
deep dive. Let's learn, how many Native faculty members do you have? How many Native students do you have? A Native American Studies program, minor classes? What does your school do during Native American Heritage Month? You should be doing
okay.
stuff outside of November too, that type of thing. Especially it was like, oh, you used to have a Native American mascot. So navigating those things. So that's something I'm interested in. So if anybody wants me to do that work, I would love to do it. And so that's what I've thinking about, getting on that entrepreneurship train, similar to how you do with international student athletes, of how can I benefit or how can I help schools, or whether it's
Mhm.
K through 12, like post-secondary, what have you, help you in that regard of, hey, we need somebody who actually, I don't want to say actually cares about this, but who's interested and has
Seriously.
the knowledge around Native Americans to help us actually do good things versus like trying something and then being like, oh, you definitely didn't have an ally or somebody a part of that community in your corner when you were planning that. How many times that happens when we're looking
Mm,
at marketing of something? We're like, oh, no
just,
black person was there when you did that, or
mm-hmm.
that type of thing. So
Mm-hmm.
that's something I would enjoy doing. So if any of the listeners want me to do that, I would be more than happy to.
Got a couple. I got a couple. I was suggestion I'm gonna share with you after this podcast is over. But let me ask you this before we bounce from here. Have you met Shoni and Jude yet?
I have. So I actually ended up becoming kind of friends with Shoni while I was while she was at U of L.
Good.
I will say, figured it out because she was dating somebody on the softball team. And so I started going to softball games. And that's how I ended up becoming friends with her. But also,
Oh,
U of
dope.
L softball, like that also, like high school is a struggle mental health wise too. Mental health, just life has been struggle, apparently. But going to U of L softball games also got me through some tough times too. So because
It's a
of
blessing.
Shoni and her dating somebody on the softball team, that also helped me. So again,
Dang.
college sports just be pouring into me so much that I'm like, my life would be so different if college sports was not in my life. That's
Yeah.
something else I forgot to mention was for my common application when we were applying to Ohio State, the essay was, where do you feel the most content, and write about that. And I wrote about sporting events. Like literally that's how I got
Dang.
to college, was talking about my love for going to sports. Like,
Gosh, worse.
so
Yeah.
legit, this is my life.
Wow. Wow, Amari, phenomenal episode. Like I said, I'm excited to share this very soon. But I think what you've described as far as urgency for support, acknowledgement, amplification, is very clear. Like I said, I think there's a few people who will listen to this episode that will immediately hit you, but there's a couple people right now I'm thinking like I'm gonna send to you right after this episode is over. But I do appreciate your time and look forward to seeing his work, continue to grow. Because it's here. Everything is
Yeah.
here for sure.
Your work too.
We're doing it, man. I think it's yeah. Let me get off this mic before I say too
We
much. But
walking.
we, we are walking. But for everyone else, man, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Walk with TAB. Definitely connect with Amari because they're very serious and that they will help to support the work that you were committed to doing, supporting Native American athletes, but also Indigenous communities, both local to your community, but across, quite honestly, this world. Just a few episodes left, man, as we close out season 5 of season 5 of this podcast, of course. But can't wait, man. See y'all next Tuesday. But as always, until then, we walking. Peace.